My greedy brother took the millions but missed the glove box. Big mistake. My old man, Captain Wesley Thompson, died 3 weeks ago. Lung cancer. The kind that eats you from the inside out until there's nothing left but bones and memories. I was there for every single day of those last 6 months. Every doctor's appointment. Every chemo session that left him puking his guts out. Every midnight when he'd wake up gasping for air, and I'd have to calm him down like he was a scared kid instead of the toughest son of a gun who ever sailed the Bering Sea. My brother Mike showed up exactly twice during those 6 months. Once at the beginning when the doctors first gave Dad the diagnosis, and once at the very end when it was clear the old man was checking out. Both times he flew in from Miami where he runs some kind of investment consultant business that I've never fully understood. Something about optimizing portfolios for high net worth individuals. The kind of work where you wear expensive suits and never get your hands dirty. I remember the last time Mike called before Dad died. It was a week out from the end. I was sitting in that hospice room that smelled like industrial strength cleaning solution trying to mask the smell of death. The monitors were beeping their steady rhythm, and Dad was drifting in and out of consciousness. My phone buzzed with video call. Mike's face filled the screen, all tan and perfect teeth. Behind him, I could see blue water and hear people laughing. He was on a yacht somewhere off the Florida coast. He asked if the old man was still hanging on, said he had some business meetings lined up, but could probably reschedule if things were getting close. Then he told me not to sign anything without him when Dad passed, said we needed to optimize his estate for tax purposes. He said it just like that, optimize his estate. Like he was talking about a stock portfolio instead of our father. The thing is, Dad was awake. His eyes were closed, but I could see them moving under the lids. He heard every word. When Mike hung up, I leaned in close and told Dad I'd be there with him until the end. That he didn't have to worry about anything. His eyes opened just a crack, and something passed between us. I thought it was gratitude. Now I'm not so sure what it was. Dad died on a Tuesday morning while I was holding his hand. Mike made it back 2 days later for the funeral, rolling up in a rented Range Rover that probably cost more for a week than my mortgage payment. But 2 days before that funeral, something happened that should have warned me. I'd come home to shower and change clothes after 48 hours straight at the hospice. Linda was sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of our bank statements spread out in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. She didn't ask how Dad was doing. Didn't ask if I needed anything. She looked up at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before and asked if I'd paid the home care nurse again from our joint account. Said we were overdrawn. Said Aunt Carol had just called to tell her that Mike and his girlfriend had bought a new yacht and were posting pictures from some resort in the Bahamas. She told me Mike was thriving while we were drowning. Said I was dragging us down to the bottom with my dying old man. Those were her exact words. My dying old man. Like he was some stranger instead of the person who'd walked her down the aisle when her own father refused to show up. I was too tired to fight. Just told her the nurse had to be paid. That Dad needed round-the-clock care. She slammed the calculator down and said maybe it was time I started thinking about my living family instead of my dead one. Dad wasn't even gone yet, and she was already writing him off. I should have seen it then. Should have realized she'd been talking to Mike, getting her exit strategy lined up. But I was too exhausted, too focused on Dad to connect the dots. Mike looked like he'd just stepped off a yacht, which he probably had. Perfect tan, manicured nails, a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Meanwhile, I was wearing a cheap black suit that was too tight in the shoulders because I'd gained weight from stress eating during Dad's illness. My hands still had engine grease under the nails from fixing the generator at Dad's house the night before he died. The funeral was small. Dad didn't have many friends left. Most of the old-timers from his fishing days were already gone or too sick to make the trip. It rained because of course it did. That cold October rain that soaks through everything and settles into your bones. I stood there watching them lower my father into the ground and felt nothing but emptiness. Mike stood under a golf umbrella, checking his phone. I got rained on because I'd forgotten mine in the truck and didn't care enough to go back for it. After the burial, everyone headed back to their cars. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few vehicles scattered across the wet asphalt. I was walking toward my beat-up Toyota Tundra, the one with 280,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that's been on for so long I've forgotten what it feels like to have it off. I had $430 in my checking account and a credit card that was nearly maxed out from paying for Dad's home care nurse, because Mike said he was tied up with a big client and couldn't chip in. That's when Linda, my wife of 22 years, stopped me. She wasn't crying. I noticed that right away. Everyone else had at least pretended to be sad, but Linda's eyes were completely dry. She was looking past me at Mike's Range Rover. She told me we needed to talk. Right there in the cemetery parking lot with rain dripping off the trees. She said it. Said I was just like my father, honest and broke. Said her mother always told her that Mike was the future, and I was the past. Said she was tired of counting pennies and wondering if we'd make the mortgage payment each month. Then came the part that actually broke something inside me. She said Mike had offered her a job in his Miami office. Administrative work, good salary, benefits, and housing. He'd offered her housing. I just stood there with rain running down my face, trying to process what she was telling me. 22 years. 2 kids who were grown and gone. A mortgage we'd paid together. A life we'd built from nothing. And she was leaving me for my brother. Not romantically, she made that clear, but leaving me nonetheless. Trading me in for the successful model. She walked past me and got into Mike's Range Rover. Just like that. My wife climbed into my brother's rental car, and they drove away together, leaving me standing there in a cemetery parking lot in a suit that didn't fit, wondering what the hell had just happened to my life. I sat in my truck for a long time after that. The rain hammered on the roof, and the windows fogged up. I couldn't afford to run the heater, so I just sat there shivering and tried to figure out where everything had gone wrong. Had I been a bad husband? A bad son? I'd worked my whole life. Never cheated, never lied, never asked for anything I hadn't earned. And this was what I got. The reading of it will happen 3 days later at a law office downtown. One of those places with glass and steel and leather furniture that probably cost more than my truck. The lawyer, some guy named Patterson in a suit that fit him perfectly, sat us down in a conference room with a view of the harbor. Mike showed up looking like he owned the place. Linda came with him, sitting at his side like they were a team now. She wouldn't even look at me. Patterson pulled out a laptop and said Dad had recorded a video, Will. Said he'd made it about a month before he died, when he still had the strength to sit up and talk clearly. The screen flickered to life, and there was my father. God, he looked awful. Thin and gray, his eyes sunken into his skull. But his voice was steady. He'd always had that captain's voice, the kind that could cut through a storm. He started with Mike. Said Mike loved the shiny things in life. Loved playing businessman. Said he was leaving him the Sea King, Dad's prime fishing vessel worth $2.5 million, according to the last appraisal. Plus the house, the bank accounts, the stock portfolio. Everything that glittered. Mike was grinning like he'd won the lottery. He actually fist-pumped under the table. Linda squeezed his arm. Then Dad turned his attention to me on that video. Said I knew the value of iron and steel. Said I understood what real work meant. He was leaving me old Betsy Incorporated, the limited liability company that held title to his first boat, the one that had been sitting in dry dock for the last 10 years, rusting away. Said I should go through his archives because there was a mess of old paperwork and debts that needed sorting out. That was it. That was my inheritance. A rusted-out boat that probably couldn't even float anymore and a pile of old bills. Patterson cleared his throat and explained the situation. Said there were environmental fines attached to old Betsy dating back to 1998. Some kind of fuel spill violations that had never been fully resolved. Said the penalties and accumulated interest came to about $15,000. Mike actually laughed out loud. He looked at me with something ugly in his eyes, something that had been festering for years. Told me I'd always played the favorite son, always been Dad's little shadow. Said I'd changed the old man's bedpans and held his hand like some kind of devoted servant, and this was my reward, a pile of junk for years of service. He leaned across the table and said Dad never respected me, just used me. Said I was too stupid to see the difference between love and exploitation. Said at least now we both knew where we really stood in the old man's eyes. Patterson slid some papers across the table. Standard estate stuff. Acknowledgement of inheritance. Assumption of liabilities. All that legal language that makes your eyes cross. Mike signed his papers with a flourish, already talking on his phone to some realtor about listing Dad's house. When Patterson got to the old Betsy papers, Mike practically threw a second document at me. It was a waiver of interest form. He was officially refusing any claim to my inheritance, specifically so he wouldn't be on the hook for any of the debts or liabilities attached to it. He signed it right there, still laughing, making jokes about how I'd always been Dad's little helper, and now I got to clean up his messes in death just like I had in life. Linda didn't even try to hide her smirk. There was one other thing on that conference table. Dad's old captain's hat. The worn blue one with the anchor embroidered on the front. He'd worn that thing for 30 years, through storms and calm seas, through good seasons and bad. It was stained with salt water and sweat and probably a few things I didn't want to think about. Mike picked it up, turned it over in his perfectly manicured hands like it was contaminated, called it junk. Then he tossed it in the wastebasket next to Patterson's desk. I didn't say anything, just reached over, picked out the trash, brushed off some coffee grounds that had gotten on the brim, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Patterson finished up the paperwork, and everyone stood to leave. Mike and Linda were already planning where to have dinner. Some steakhouse downtown that I couldn't afford even if I wanted to eat there. They walked out together, her hand on his arm, talking about Miami and new beginnings and opportunities. I stayed behind to ask Patterson a few questions about the old Betsy situation. He was sympathetic, but not helpful. Said I could try to dissolve the LLC and walk away, but the fines would likely follow me personally. Said my best bet was probably to pay off the debts, and then try to sell the boat for scrap. Maybe break even if I was lucky. I thanked him and walked out into the parking garage. Found my truck 3 levels down, sitting there like a faithful old dog waiting for its owner. The passenger side mirror was held on with duct tape. The paint was oxidized to hell. But it started every time I turned the key, which was more than I could say for a lot of other things in my life. I climbed in and just sat there for a while. Didn't start the engine, didn't go anywhere. Just sat in the cold garage with my thoughts. Through the concrete pillars, I could see Mike's Range Rover pulling out onto the street. Linda was in the passenger seat. They were probably heading to that steakhouse right now, celebrating their good fortune. Mike got the Empire. Linda got her escape. And I got a broken boat and a pile of debts. I pulled Dad's captain's hat out of my pocket and held it in my hands. It was heavy with history, worn soft from years of use. The fabric was faded, but the anchor emblem was still clear. I remember being a kid, maybe 7 or 8, and Dad letting me wear this hat while he taught me how to read the water. He'd point out the signs of good fishing, the way the birds moved, the color of the sky, the feel of the wind. Said someday this would all be mine if I wanted it. I'd wanted it. God, I wanted it so badly. Spent my whole life working beside him, learning the business from the bottom up, cleaned fish guts, mended nets, worked double shifts in freezing water. Did everything right, and Mike had swooped in at the end and taken it all without ever getting his hands dirty. I sat there in my truck watching the empty space where my brother's rental had been, holding that old hat, try to understand what I'd done wrong, try and figure out why being loyal, being present, being the good son had earned me nothing but betrayal. The parking garage was quiet except for the drip of water from the rain earlier and the distant hum of traffic. My breath fogged up the windows. I was 50 years old, broke, alone, and holding a dead man's hat like it was some kind of prize. I didn't understand then what Dad had really left me. Didn't understand the test he'd set up or the lesson he was trying to teach. All I understood was that I'd lost everything, and the people I'd loved most in the world had been the ones to take it from me. I carefully folded the captain's hat and set it on the passenger seat, where Linda used to sit. Then I started the truck and listened to it cough and rattle to life. The engine noise echoed off the concrete walls of the parking garage. I sat there with my hand on the gear shift, trying to figure out where to go. Linda had changed the locks by now. Probably, even if she hadn't, I wasn't going back to that house to beg for a place to sleep. I had $430 in my account and nowhere to go except maybe some flea-bag motel that charged by the week. Then I looked at that captain's hat sitting next to me and realized something. I did have a place. Not a home exactly, but a roof. Old Betsy was sitting in dry dock at the harbor, and technically I owned her now. The LLC papers were in my glove box with my name on them as a new registered agent. She wouldn't be warm, and she probably leaked when it rained. But she was mine, the only thing in this whole mess that actually belonged to me. I touched the worn fabric of Dad's hat one more time, then put the truck in gear and headed out of the garage. The city lights blurred past as I drove through streets I'd known my whole life, heading toward the industrial part of the harbor where the old boats went to die, heading toward Old Betsy. The harbor district looked different at night, emptier, the kind of empty that makes you realize how alone you really are. I drove past a nice marina where Mike Sea King was probably already docked, all gleaming fiberglass and fresh paint, then kept going into the industrial section where the old boats went to rust in peace. Old Betsy sat in dry dock number 7, propped up on wooden cradles like some beach whale that had given up on the ocean. Even in the dark, I could see the streaks of rust running down her hull like tears. The paint had peeled away in patches, showing bare metal underneath. She looked exactly like what Mike had called her, a piece of junk, but she was my piece of junk now. I parked the Tundra in the gravel lot and grabbed my emergency duffel from behind the seat. I'd kept it there since my fishing days, back when I used to work Dad's boats during the summer seasons. It had a change of clothes, a sleeping bag, and not much else. Everything a man needed when he had nowhere else to go. The ladder up to the deck was rusty and missing a few rungs. I climbed carefully, testing each step. The metal was cold even through my jacket. October in the Pacific Northwest doesn't mess around. The wind coming off the water cut right through you. The deck was covered in bird droppings and dead leaves. I'd picked my way across to the wheelhouse, found the door unlocked because who was going to steal anything from this wreck, and stepped inside. It smelled like mildew and old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. Time, maybe? The smell of time passing and things falling apart. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to look around. The captain's chair was still there, the vinyl cracked and split. The instruments were all dead, their faces dark. There was a small cabin below the wheelhouse, and that's where I found what passed for living quarters. A narrow bunk with a stained mattress, a tiny galley with a sink that probably didn't work, and a table bolted to the floor. And boxes. Dozens of cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, some of them so old the cardboard was turning soft and brown at the edges. I set up my sleeping bag on the bunk and realized immediately this was going to be a miserable night. It was maybe 40 degrees outside and probably colder inside. My breath came out in visible puffs. I could see stars through a crack in the ceiling where the roof had started to separate. This was my inheritance. This was what loyalty got you. I couldn't sleep. The cold was part of it, but mostly it was my mind spinning in circles. I kept thinking about Linda's face when she got into Mike's Range Rover, kept hearing my brother's laugh when he signed that waiver of interest, kept seeing Dad's face on that video screen, so thin and gray, telling me to sort through his archives like that was some kind of gift. Finally, I gave up trying to sleep and started going through the boxes. Maybe there was something in here worth selling. Old equipment, spare parts, something I could turn into cash to pay off those environmental fines and walk away from this nightmare. Most of it was junk. 30-year-old receipts for diesel fuel. Maintenance logs from boats Dad didn't even own anymore. Faded photographs of crews I didn't recognize. I went through box after box, my hands getting dirty with dust and mold, finding nothing but memories of a business that didn't exist anymore. Then, in a box marked Admin 1990-2000, I found something strange, a receipt for a government fee, dated just 1 month before Dad died. The description said license renewal commercial fishing permit. The amount was $240. I stared at it in the beam of my phone's flashlight, try and make sense of it. Why would Dad pay to renew a fishing license for Old Betsy? The boat hadn't been in the water for 10 years. She'd been sitting in this dry dock since before I got married, rusting away while Dad ran his operations off the newer vessels. It didn't make any sense to maintain paperwork on a dead ship. Unless there was something about that paperwork I didn't understand. I started digging deeper into that box, looking for anything else related to licenses or permits. Found some old tax documents. Found a bill of sale from 1978 when Dad had bought old Betsy brand new. Found inspection reports and safety certificates. Then I found something that made me stop cold. A small brass key taped to the inside of a manila folder. No label, no explanation. Just a key. I sat there on the cold floor of that cabin, holding this key, and tried to remember if I'd seen a safe anywhere on the boat. Dad had always been paranoid about keeping important documents secure. He'd grown up during a time when you didn't trust computers, when paper mattered, and you kept the important stuff locked up. It took me 20 minutes of searching before I found it. Built into the bulkhead behind what looked like a regular panel, there was a small wall safe, the kind you'd find in a cheap hotel room. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a single waterproof document case, the kind designed for maritime use. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. This felt important in a way I couldn't quite explain, like finding buried treasure or opening a tomb. The case opened with a soft click. On top was a letter, handwritten on Dad's personal stationery, the kind with the anchor watermark. My name was on the envelope. I had to read it twice before it started to make sense. He called me son, which he rarely did in writing. Said if I was reading this, he was gone, and I'd probably spend the last few days thinking he betrayed me. Said Mike had gotten the shiny toys and I'd gotten the garbage. And knowing me, I'd be sitting on this boat right now trying to figure out how to pay off debts I didn't deserve. Then he wrote something that made my throat tight. Said Mike had always been the smart one, the ambitious one, the one who knew how to make money. But I was the one who understood what mattered. I was the one who knew the difference between price and value. I was the one who'd stayed. He said the environmental fines were bait, set there deliberately to scare off Mike's lawyers, to make sure they did exactly what they did, run away from Old Betsy Incorporated without looking deeper. Because Old Betsy Incorporated didn't just own a rusty boat. It owned something else, something that had been sitting in that safe, quietly appreciating in value for 47 years. I set the letter aside and pulled out the next document. It was a certificate, yellow with age, dated March 15, 1978. The letterhead said National Marine Fisheries Service, which had been the old name before they reorganized into NOAA. The document was titled Limited Entry Permit, Historical Allocation Class A. I had no idea what I was looking at. I pulled out my laptop from my duffel. It was old. The battery barely held a charge, but it had internet access through my phone's hotspot. I sat there on the floor of that freezing cabin and started researching. The first few articles I found were dense government documents, the kind written by bureaucrats for other bureaucrats. But slowly, piece by piece, I started to understand what I was holding. Back in the 70s, the fishing industry was chaos. Too many boats chasing too few fish. The government stepped in and created a system called limited entry. They issued permits to boats that could prove they'd been fishing certain grounds for certain species. If you had a permit, you could fish. If you didn't, you were shut out. But the really valuable permits were the ones issued in those first few years. The Historical Allocation Class A permits. They were given to boats that had been working the grounds before the system even existed. And here's the part that made my heart start pounding. Those permits weren't tied to the physical boat. They were tied to the company that owned the boat, which meant even though Old Betsy herself was worthless as a vessel, Old Betsy Incorporated still held that original 1978 permit, and that permit was still valid. I went to the NOAA website, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard, found the permit database, entered the number from the certificate. The page loaded slowly, my phone's hotspot struggling with the connection. And then there it was, active status. The permit was still live because Dad had been paying the renewal fees religiously right up until a month before he died. But permits weren't the whole story. I kept reading, kept clicking through government websites and fishing industry forums, trying to understand why Dad had guarded this so carefully. That's when I found out about catch shares. In the mid-90s, the government had reformed the whole system again. Instead of just permits that let you fish, they created individual fishing quotas. Basically, they divided up the total allowable catch for each species and gave each permit holder a percentage. If you had an old historical Class A permit, you got a bigger share because you'd been in the game longer. The beauty of it was that you could lease out your quota. You didn't have to own a boat. You didn't have to go fishing. You could just sit on your percentage of the catch and rent it to someone else who wanted to fish. And the quota Old Betsy Incorporated held was for Alaskan crab. I dug deeper into the files on the NOAA site, looking for transaction history. Found something that explained why Dad had been struggling financially these last few years. The quota hadn't been leased out since 2 seasons ago, right around the time he got his diagnosis. Made sense. Dad had been too sick to handle the business side, and Mike sure as hell wasn't going to help manage some paperwork for a company he didn't know existed. So the quota had just sat there and used, not generating income, just existing on paper, while its value kept climbing with the crab prices, which meant this coming season, the quota was completely available. Clean slate, ready to lease to whoever had the permit in their name. I knew enough about the industry to know what that meant. Crab quotas were liquid gold. A single percentage point could lease for hundreds of thousands per season. And according to the documents in the safe, Old Betsy Incorporated held a 1.7% share of the total allowable catch. I pulled up my calculator app and started doing math. Found the average market prices for quota leases. Found the total catch numbers from last season. Started multiplying. The numbers didn't make sense at first. I thought I'd made a mistake. Did it again. Same result. Old Betsy Incorporated's quota was worth somewhere between $1.8 and $2.2 million per year in lease fees. Per year, not as a one-time sale. Every single year, someone paid that much to rent our percentage of catch. Mike's boat, the Sea King, was worth $2.5 million as a physical asset, but it was a depreciating asset. It cost money to maintain. It sat in the water rusting and losing value every day. The quota didn't rust, didn't need maintenance, didn't depreciate. It just sat there generating passive income year after year after year. I sat on that cold floor with these documents spread around me and started to laugh. Not a happy laugh. A slightly unhinged laugh of someone who's just realized they've been given a winning lottery ticket disguised as trash. Dad hadn't punished me. He'd protected me. He'd given me the real wealth and made it look worthless so Mike would run away from it. Those environmental fines were pocket change compared to what the quota generated. Hell, I could pay them off with 1 month's lease income. And here's the genius part. Mike thought he'd gotten everything fishing related when he took the Sea King. He had no idea this quota existed separately. If he decided to use Dad's old fishing records, he'd find reference to permits and quotas that he'd assume came with his estate. He'd see paperwork with Dad's name and figure it was all his now as the primary heir. He wouldn't check. Why would he? He'd gotten the boat, the house, the accounts. In his mind, anything with Dad's name on it belonged to him now. But there was a problem. The permit was still registered under Dad's name as the director of Old Betsy Incorporated. I needed to update it to reflect that I was the new director now. Otherwise, someone could challenge the ownership. I looked at my bank account on my phone. $430. The LLC paperwork from the lawyer was in my truck, but I'd need to register the transfer, update the NOAA database, maybe pay some fees. I'd also need to understand exactly what I was doing before I touched anything. This was too important to screw up. The next morning, I was standing outside a maritime law office when they opened at 8. I'd spend the rest of the night reading everything I could find about fishing quotas and permit transfers. My eyes felt like sandpaper, and I probably smelled like the inside of an old boat. But I didn't care. The lawyer specialized in fishing industry stuff. His office had model boats on the shelves and old photographs of trawlers on the walls. He took one look at me and probably assumed I was there to file for bankruptcy. I laid the certificate on his desk and asked him to verify it was real. Watched his eyebrows go up when he saw the date. Watched him pull up the NOAA database and check the permit number. He told me what I'd already figured out. This was a historical Class A permit with associated quota rights. It was fully transferable with the LLC. And yes, the current market for leasing this particular quota was substantial. I asked him what I needed to do to protect it. He said I needed to file updated paperwork with Noah showing me as the new director of Old Betsy Incorporated. There'd be some fees. Maybe $800 altogether with his service charges. I had a problem. I had $430 in my account and $17 in my wallet. That was it. Everything else Linda had access to was joint accounts she'd probably already emptied. The lawyer must have seen something in my face because he asked if I had any assets I could liquidate quickly. I thought about the truck, but I needed it to get around. Thought about my tools, but they weren't worth much. Then I remembered the watch. It was a Rolex Submariner. Not a new one, but a real one from the 80s. Dad had given it to me on my 30th birthday. Said every captain needed a good watch. It had kept perfect time for 20 years. I'd worn it through a marriage, through good times and bad, through everything. I drove to a pawn shop on the east side. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd seen everything and been impressed by nothing. He examined the watch through a loop, checked the serial number, ran it through some database, offered me $800. Said it was probably worth double that, but he had to make a profit. I took the deal. Didn't even try to negotiate. Watched him slide my father's watch into a display case with a price tag of $1,800 on it. Walked out with $800 bills that felt like they weighed nothing. By noon, I'd paid the lawyer. By 2 o'clock, the paperwork was filed electronically with Noah. By 3 o'clock, I was back on Old Betsy with my laptop, refreshing the permit database page over and over like a crazy person. It took 6 hours for the system to update. 6 hours of sitting in that cold cabin, drinking instant coffee I'd made with a camping stove, wearing every piece of clothing I owned. When the page finally refreshed and showed my name as a registered director of Old Betsy Incorporated, when the status field showed that green word active, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Dad got sick. Hope. Actual, real hope. I sat there staring at that screen until the sun went down, and it got too cold to keep my fingers on the keyboard. Sat there thinking about Mike on his yacht in Miami, probably already spending money from Dad's estate. Thinking about Linda and her new office job, probably already forgetting I existed. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten everything and left me with nothing. But they'd walked away from millions. Literally walked away from generational wealth because they couldn't see past the rust and the debt. Because they'd never understood what Dad was trying to teach us. That value and price aren't the same thing. That the shiniest object isn't always the most valuable. I saved a screenshot of that active status and closed my laptop. Then I pulled Dad's captain's hat from my jacket pocket, where I'd been carrying it like a talisman. Put it on my head for the first time. It fit perfectly. For the first time in 3 weeks, I smiled. Not a big smile. Not a happy smile. But the kind of smile that meant I knew something nobody else knew. The kind of smile that meant the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The smile didn't last long. Sitting there in that freezing cabin with the knowledge of what I owned, I realized something that made my stomach turn. Mike was going to use that quota. He had to. He'd just inherited a $2.5 million fishing vessel, and he wanted to put to work immediately. The crab season was opening in 2 weeks. And when he went looking through Dad's files for permits and fishing rights, he'd find references to quotas. He'd see Dad's name on old documents and assume it was all his now. Why wouldn't he? He'd gotten everything else. I spent the next 3 days barely sleeping, barely eating, just thinking through every angle. Part of me wanted to call him, to warn him that the quota wasn't his. But another part of me, the part that had watched him laugh at Dad's funeral, the part that had seen Linda climb into his Range Rover, that part wanted to see what would happen if I just stayed quiet. On the 4th day after I'd registered the permit transfer, I drove down to Commercial Pier, where the Sea King was being prepped for the season. It was early morning, that gray hour before sunrise when the working boats start their day. I could see the deck lights on from 3 blocks away. I parked the Tundra and walked down the pier. My boots echoed on the wooden planks. The air smelled like diesel fuel and salt water and fish. Smelled like every morning of my youth when I'd worked these same docks beside my father. The Sea King looked magnificent. Mike had already hired a full crew, 6 guys moving around the deck checking gear and loading supplies. The boat was gleaming white with fresh paint, all the electronics updated. Everything state-of-the-art. This was a serious fishing operation. Mike was on the bridge deck with Linda. She was wearing designer jeans and a jacket that probably cost more than my truck payment. He had on one of those expensive outdoor coats that guys wear when they want to look rugged, without actually being rugged. They were drinking coffee from a thermos, looking like they were about to go on a pleasure cruise instead of fishing trip. I called up to him, told him we needed to talk. He looked down at me like I was a bum asking for change, asked what I was doing there, asked if I'd come to beg for a job on the crew. I kept my voice level, told him he needed to check the NOAA database before he left port, told him there had been changes to the quota registration, told him specifically that he needed to verify his fishing rights before he harvested anything. Mike laughed, actually threw his head back and laughed. Linda was smirking beside him, that same look she'd given me in the cemetery parking lot. He said I was pathetic, said jealousy was eating me alive, told me to go find a real job instead of bothering people who actually knew how to make money, said his lawyers had checked the estate thoroughly and everything Dad owned was his now, said the quota came with the fleet. It was all part of the inheritance. I tried one more time, told him that old Betsy Incorporated held certain rights that didn't transfer with the Sea King. Told him he should really check the quota ownership before he left. He told me to get lost. Said if I didn't leave the pier he'd have security remove me. Then he turned to his crew and ordered them to cast off the lines. The engines rumbled to life, that deep throaty sound of powerful diesels warming up. Linda never even looked at me, just stood there with her coffee, watching the crew work. I stood on that pier and watched the Sea King pull away from the dock, watched it motor out of the harbor into the open water. Part of me still hoped Mike would turn around, would check the database, would realize his mistake before it was too late. But a bigger part of me knew he wouldn't. Mike had never checked anything in his life. He just assumed the world would bend to accommodate him. I drove back to old Betsy and set up my laptop in the cabin. The NOAA vessel monitoring system is public information if you know where to look. Every commercial fishing boat over 65 feet has to carry a VMS transponder that reports its position to the government in real time. It's how they enforce fishing boundaries and catch limits. I pulled up the Sea King's transponder ID and watched the little blue move across the digital map. Mike was heading straight for the Bering Sea Crab grounds, right on schedule. Moving fast, probably running at full throttle to get to the fishing grounds before the other boats. The laptop became my whole world for the next 72 hours. I'd set an alarm to wake me up every few hours to check the position, watch that blue dot travel north, then west, then finally stop at the coordinates where the crab pots would be. On the second day, the boat stopped moving except for slow drift patterns. They were fishing, pulling up pots, sorting crab, filling the holds. I could picture it perfectly because I'd done it myself 100 times. The ache in your back from hauling heavy pots, the sting of cold water, the adrenaline when you pull up a pot full of legal-sized males. Mike was probably having the time of his life, probably calling Linda every few hours to tell her about the catch, probably already counting the money. I made myself wait. This was the hard part. Every hour that passed was another few thousand pounds of crab in his hold, another $10,000 in a legal catch, another nail in his coffin. The Magnuson-Stevens Act is pretty clear about quota violations. If you harvest without proper authorization, if you exceed your allotted catch, if you fish in closed areas, you're not just looking at fines. The government can seize your vessel as an instrument of crime. They can hold you personally liable for the value of illegal catch plus penalties that can run into millions of dollars. But for it to really stick, for it to be the kind of violation that ruins you, the catch has to be substantial. Small violations get warnings, maybe small fines. Big violations get you arrested and your boat impounded. So I waited, watched that blue, stay in the fishing grounds, checked the weather reports to see if they were having good conditions. They were. Perfect fishing weather. Mike's holds were probably nearly full by now. On the morning of the third day, the Blue started moving back toward port. The Sea King was heading home. I could imagine Mike on the bridge, calculating his profits, planning how to spend it, probably thinking about buying a bigger boat next season. I opened a new window on my laptop and navigated to the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement online reporting system. Took me an hour to fill out the form properly. Had to be precise, had to cite the right regulations, had to provide documentation. I uploaded a screenshot of my registered permit showing I was the director of Old Betsy Incorporated and the legal owner of the quota. Uploaded the certificate showing the quota allocation. Provided the transponder ID of the Sea King and the dates it had been fishing. Then I wrote a statement explaining that no lease agreement existed between Old Betsy Incorporated and the vessel Sea King. Explained that any catch taken by that vessel during the specified dates was taken without legal authority. Requested immediate investigation and enforcement action. My finger hovered over the submit button for a long time. This wasn't just reporting a violation. This was destroying my brother. This was taking everything he thought he'd won and crushing it to dust. I thought about Dad, about those last days in the hospice when Mike couldn't be bothered to show up, about Linda asking me to beg for scraps while Mike bought yachts, about that laugh in the lawyer's office when he signed away his rights to Old Betsy Inc. I clicked submit. The Sea King was due to dock at 4 in the afternoon. I knew this because commercial fishing boats have to file their arrival times in advance, so the buyers and processors can be ready. I drove down the pier at 3:30, parked where I could see the entrance to the commercial dock, and waited. At 3:45, 3 unmarked SUVs pulled into the pier parking lot. Men in tactical gear got out. Some were wearing jackets that said NOAA Office of Law Enforcement. Others were Coast Guard. They weren't messing around. They set up at the end of the dock, where the Sea King would tie up, just standing there, waiting. A couple of them were carrying what looked like AR-15s. Not aimed at anyone, just present. The universal symbol that this was serious federal business. At 4:15, the Sea King motored into view. I could see Mike on the bridge, talking on his phone, probably calling the fish processor to get them ready. The boat looked low in the water, heavy with a full catch. As the Sea King approached the dock, I saw the moment Mike noticed something was wrong. The boat's engines suddenly throttled down. He'd seen the federal agents, seen the vehicles, probably seen the weapons, but it was too late to turn around. You can't just flee from the Coast Guard in a fishing boat. They have helicopters, fast boats, the whole 9 yards, and running would only make everything worse. The Sea King came alongside the dock, and the crew threw the lines. Before they could even tie off properly, the agents were boarding. I watched from my truck as they swarmed onto the deck. I could see Linda up on the bridge deck. Even from a distance, I could see her face go white. She'd been smiling when they approached the dock. She wasn't smiling anymore. Mike was arguing with the lead agent. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the body language. Mike pointing at papers, gesturing angrily. The agent just standing there with his arms crossed, unmoved. Then the agent pulled out handcuffs. That's when Mike's posture changed. The swagger disappeared. His shoulders slumped. He put his hands behind his back without being told. I watched them cuff him and lead him down the gangway. Linda was crying now, calling down from the bridge. They handcuffed her too. She wasn't the captain, but she'd been present during the illegal fishing. That made her complicit. The crew was detained but not arrested. They'd been hired hands who probably had no idea the quota situation wasn't legit. They sat on the dock with their hands visible, looking confused and angry. A refrigerated truck pulled up. The agent started unloading the catch, documenting everything. Hundreds of pounds of king crab, all of it evidence now. I knew what would happen to it. After the trial, it would be sold at auction, and the money would go to the federal government. All that work, all that risk, all those fish Mike had been counting as profit, gone. Not just gone, but used as evidence against him. I pulled my phone out and looked up the penalties for the Magnuson-Stevens Act violations. If they charged him with a maximum, he was looking at 5 years in federal prison and fines up to $2 million. Plus, they could seize the Sea King itself as an instrument of crime. I sat there in my truck until they loaded Mike and Linda into separate vehicles and drove away. Sat there until they posted guards on a boat and strung yellow crime scene tape across the gangway. Sat there until the sun started to set and the pier emptied out, and it was just me and that impounded $2.5 million fishing vessel that my brother had inherited and lost in less than a month. Then I opened my laptop one more time. The blue that had been the Sea King was now marked with a red X, status seized. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark truck, listening to the water lap against the pilings. Didn't feel victorious. Didn't feel happy. Just felt tired. And maybe a little bit satisfied that someone had finally taught Mike that actions have consequences. The call came 2 days later. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. It was Mike's lawyer. Very polite, very professional. Said his client was requesting a meeting. Said Mike wanted to discuss a possible resolution to the current legal situation. Asked if I would be willing to meet at the Federal Detention Center. I said I'd think about it and hung up. Spent the whole day thinking about it. Part of me wanted to let him rot. Let him face the full consequences of his arrogance. But another part of me, the part that still remembered him as a kid, as my little brother before money and ambition had turned him into someone I didn't recognize, that part was curious. I called the lawyer back and agreed to meet. The Federal Detention Center was exactly as depressing as you'd imagine. Gray concrete, harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of industrial cleaner trying to mask other smells. They made me go through metal detectors and pat-downs before leading me to a small conference room with a table and plastic chairs. Mike looked terrible. They'd given him an orange jumpsuit that was too big. His tan had faded to a sickly gray. His hair was messy, and he had dark circles under his eyes. This wasn't the smug, confident man who'd laughed at me on the pier. He looked like someone who'd lost everything and was just starting to understand how far he'd fallen. His lawyer was there, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who probably cost $500 an hour. She laid out the situation in clinical terms. The government had charged Mike with willful violation of fishing quotas, falsification permit documents, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The total value of illegal catch exceeded $400,000, which made it a federal felony. Asset forfeiture proceedings had been initiated against the Sea King. They were also going after the house and the bank accounts as proceeds of illegal activity, since Mike had used inherited money to outfit the boat for the illegal fishing trip. Mike's legal defense was going to cost a fortune. If convicted, he faced 5 years minimum. The fines alone would bankrupt him. The lawyer stopped talking and looked at me, asked if I understood the situation. I said I did. Then she said they'd done some research into the quota ownership, found out about Old Betsy Incorporated and the historical Class A permit, found out that I was now the registered owner of that quota. She said they'd also discovered something interesting in the maritime law regarding quota leases. She said that if a retroactive lease agreement could be produced, dated before the fishing trip took place, then technically the catch wouldn't have been illegal. It would have been authorized fishing under a lease agreement. The charges would be dropped. She looked at me very carefully when she said this, waiting to see if I understood what she was really asking. Mike was staring at the table. Wouldn't look at me. His hands were shaking. I let the silence stretch out. Made them wait. Finally I spoke. I said I might be willing to execute a retroactive lease agreement, but leases weren't free. They required payment. The lawyer asked what kind of payment I had in mind. I told her the lease fee would be the transfer of ownership of the Sea King from Mike to Old Betsy Incorporated plus $10 in cash for good measure. Made a legitimate transaction instead of a gift. Mike's head snapped up. He started to protest, but the lawyer put her hand on his arm. She was already doing the math. The Sea King was worth $2.5 million. Mike's legal defense would cost $300,000 minimum. The fines if convicted would be $2 million. Prison time was priceless if you could avoid it. By giving up the boat, Mike would save $5 million in costs and penalties, plus his freedom. It was a bargain, but it meant admitting I'd beaten him. It meant giving me everything he'd thought he'd won. The lawyer asked if Mike would be released immediately after the agreement was executed. I said that was between him and the federal prosecutor, but I'd imagine the charges would be dropped pretty quickly once the government realized the catch had been legal after all. Mike was crying, actual tears running down his face. He asked me why I was doing this to him, asked what he'd ever done to deserve this. I looked at my brother and felt something strange. Not hatred, not even anger anymore, just disappointment. I told him he'd spent his whole life thinking he was smarter than everyone else, thinking that showing up at the end and taking the easy path was the same as earning something. I told him Dad had tried to teach him the difference between price and value, but he'd never learned. I told him I'd execute the lease agreement. I'd save him from prison. But the Sea King was mine now, and Linda could keep the job in Miami if she wanted. But she'd be doing it without him because I wasn't paying to set him up in a new life. The lawyer produced papers. Probably had them drafted before the meeting even started. A retroactive lease agreement dated 2 weeks before the fishing trip, leasing the Old Betsy Incorporated quota to Michael Thompson for 1 fishing season. Payment: transfer a title of the vessel Sea King to Old Betsy Incorporated plus $10 in cash. Mike signed with shaking hands, pushed a crumpled $10 bill across the table at me. I picked up the $10 and put it in my pocket, signed the agreement, dated it properly. The lawyer notarized it right there in the conference room. I stood up to leave. Mike was still sitting there, staring at the papers like he couldn't believe what had just happened. I told him this was the lesson Dad had been trying to teach him all along, that you can't shortcut your way to respect, that the shiniest thing isn't always the most valuable thing, that family means being there when it's hard, not just showing up when there's something to inherit. I left him sitting in that conference room in his orange jumpsuit with his expensive lawyer and his crumpled pride. 2 weeks later, the charges were dropped. The government released the Sea King from impound once they verified the lease agreement was legitimate. Linda tried calling me 16 times that first day, left voicemail saying it had all been a misunderstanding, saying she'd made a mistake, saying she wanted to come home. I blocked her number. Mike flew back to Miami the day after he was released. Heard through mutual acquaintances that he took a job doing sales for a boat dealership, making commission on other people's dreams instead of chasing his own. The Sea King was mine now. I had her towed to the dry dock next to Old Betsy. Stood there looking at both of them, these 2 vessels that represented 2 completely different paths my life could have taken. I hired old Jim Patterson to be the captain. He'd worked for Dad back in the 80s, knew the waters better than anyone. He didn't ask questions about how I'd come to own the boat, just asked when we were going out. I explained to him that I wouldn't be going out at all. I owned the quota and I owned the boat, but I'd be staying on shore. He'd run the operations, hire the crew, manage the catches. Standard fishing arrangement. The boat owner takes 40%, the captain and crew split the rest. Plus I'd be leasing quota to other boats. The Old Betsy Incorporated allocation was big enough to support multiple vessels. I'd already had 3 captains contact me asking about lease terms for next season. Jim said he understood, said it was smart business, said my father would be proud. I wasn't so sure about that last part, but I appreciated him saying it. The first catch came in 3 weeks later. Jim brought the Sea King back to port loaded with premium king crab. The buyers were waiting on the dock, bidding against each other. The final price came to $680,000 for a single trip's catch. My share as boat owner was $272,000. Less expenses, less crew payments, less fuel and ice. I cleared about $150,000, and the season was just starting. I stood on the dock watching them unload the catch, wearing Dad's old captain's hat, because it felt right. The hat I'd pulled out of the trash in that lawyer's office. The hat Mike had thrown away because he couldn't see its value. Funny how things work out sometimes. I used part of that first payment to settle the environmental fines on Old Betsy. $15,000 paid in full. Then I registered her as a historic vessel with the Maritime Museum. Let her sit there in dry dock as a reminder of where it all started. The real money came from the quota leases. By the end of the first season, I'd leased out portions of the Old Betsy incorporated allocation to 7 different boats. Each one paid anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 for the privilege of fishing under my quota. Total income from leases alone, $1.4 million. And I didn't have to leave shore. Didn't have to risk my life in the Bering Sea. Didn't have to do anything except maintain the paperwork and collect the checks. I bought a small house with a view of the harbor. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Paid cash. Set up a trust for my kids, even though they were grown, and barely spoke to me anymore after the divorce. Left the money there for them anyway, because that's what you do. Linda sent me a letter 6 months after everything went down. Said she was sorry. Said she'd made the worst mistake of her life. Said she'd been seduced by the lifestyle Mike offered and hadn't realized what she was giving up until it was gone. I read the letter once and put in a drawer. Didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth rebuilding. Mike and I haven't spoken since that day in the detention center. Heard he got married again, some woman he met in Florida. Hope it works out for him. Hope he learned something from all this. But I doubt it. On the 1-year anniversary of Dad's death, I took the Sea King out myself. Just me and Jim, no crew. We didn't fish. Just motored out past the harbor into open water. I brought a bottle of Dad's favorite whiskey and poured some over the side. Told him I finally understood. The test he'd set up, the lesson he'd been teaching. He'd known Mike would take the easy path, and I'd take the hard one. He'd known Mike would see the shine, and I'd see the substance. He'd set it all up perfectly, so that we'd each get exactly what we deserved. I put on his captain's hat and stood at the wheel of the Sea King, feeling the deck roll under my feet, smelling the salt air, hearing the engines rumble. This was where I belonged, not out on the water risking my life, but here in this position, stewarding the legacy Dad had built, owning the real wealth, the quota that kept producing year after year, the knowledge that value isn't always visible, the understanding that patience and persistence matter more than flash and ambition. Jim brought me a cup of coffee in a brand new mug, not the cracked old things I'd been using on old Betsy. The steam rose up in the cold air as I held it in both hands. I looked out at the horizon where the gray water met the gray sky and thought about everything that had happened, about the tests we face, the lessons we learn, the ways life has of teaching us what we need to know. Dad had known I could handle this, had known I'd figured out, had trusted me with the real inheritance, even when it looked like I'd gotten nothing. I raised my coffee mug to the ocean and to the memory of the old captain who'd taught me everything that mattered. A new day was starting. The sun was breaking through the clouds. The Sea King's engines were running smooth and strong. Everything was exactly as it should be.